Hello, my name is Jeremy Nathaniel Akers, and I want to run you through a brief workshop on the topic of diversity and inclusion. I'd also like to thank the Gaping Void for being so kind as to sponsor this video by letting me upload this awesome cartoon as the cover art. Better to ask for forgiveness than permission. Let's go for it. So why are we talking about a workshop? Why did we run a workshop? Well, we wanted to handle this question of language for diversity and inclusion and to nail down some quick wins. At the end of the video, I'll describe why this definition of quick wins turned out to be problematic and what I learned and how to deal with that and hopefully avoid it in the future. Our participants, who was going to be in the meeting, were non-native speakers and native speakers, locals and non-locals. And the way that we were going to enlist participation from them towards this goal of quick wins was through heard, seen, and respected, and critical uncertainties. In this instance, we made use of critical uncertainties in a bit more of a classic manner. So this is maybe an interesting juxtaposition for the video I did on strategy cannot working, just so you can see a couple different flavors of how you can make use of these things. So, for our first act, that is the setup, we wanted to level the playing field and set the tone for this workshop. It's important to remember that we have two subgroups, locals and non-locals, and we want to avoid a dynamic where there are the haves and the have-nots, the powerful and the less powerful, the able and the less able in this session. So that's why we wanted to make use of heard, seen, and respected, because it helps us lean into our shared humanity. The way that we do that is in a very high-level overview, is we offer them the invitation to tell a story about a time when they felt confused, didn't understand, and could not participate with the group. Offering them that invitation, we give everyone 2 minutes of solo time to just think for themselves about an example or a story that they could tell. We then pair people in one-on-ones with 10 minutes per person for a total of 20 minutes so they can share those stories. And then we bring groups together in double dating. Groups of 4 for 5 minutes for them to sort of compare notes. And then we bring everybody together in a shared all session for us to gather and harvest the information on Post-it notes. A bit of a higher level of resolution around our invitation. And now what do I mean? We captured Post-its of the content of these conversations. So in the second round, we asked folks to in these double dates, these groups of 4, to compare notes about what were the common threads. What did they notice popped out in both your partner's conversation, and to see if those were recognized in the conversation of another pair. So this helped us do a really quick self-sorting algorithm, and it turned out that we had factors that came up in almost every single groups, and we used those for the axis of critical uncertainties. So what we noticed was that openness and sort of insecurity was one paradigm or axis that was a common thread in most conversations. What we also noticed is that there was an aspect around the content of conversations that we also noticed made things pretty tricky. Some conversations we needed more nuance or technical detail. Perhaps we were talking about abstract and or emotional content in which we needed to use a lot of care and detail. Other conversations were higher level, that were more, informal, didn't need quite so much detail. So another paradigm and axis was how much detail is involved in the conversation. And bam, we have now mapped axes for critical uncertainties. Now, critical uncertainties, what the hell am I talking about, and how does that thing go? So using critical uncertainties for the conflict as well as the resolution act in our acts in our narrative arc Our goal is to help folks understand the challenges that they are facing and enable them to do something about it. So using critical uncertainties was a good judgment call because it would help us lean into this idea of coping strategies. That again, I'll explain why that may have been a bit problematic depending on your perspective. So since we've already done, we're going to use the output of heard, seen, respected as our input to critical uncertainties. Defining the axis is already a big check. We don't actually have to do anything about that. What we're going to do then is move into trios, stable trios. We're going to ask those trios to define one of the scenarios that is in each one of those quadrants from that 2x2 matrix. After they describe that scenario, we're going to ask them to give that scenario a name. And after we have given that scenario a description and a name, we're going to ask those same groups to come back together and to describe coping strategies. What can they do to deal with that reality? So backing up to describing scenarios, what do you see, hear, and notice that lets you know you're there? And coping strategies. How do you cope with? How do you deal with that reality? And then we format our output on that 2x2 matrix you saw in Mural, and bam, we're there. We then come back together in an all-round and compare notes and share our insight or the information we have about those coping strategies. And we can do some awesome analysis. Let's show you that. So, 4 scenarios. In one scenario per quadrant based on the content that is these 2 axes. So in this quadrant, we have all these different descriptions, all of this rich information that helps us understand what the contours of that scenario are. And then, rather than having to describe those contours every time we want to invoke it, we can just say, hey, codename Hell Deep Sea, and everybody knows, oh yeah, that was that one, right? And maybe the contours have moved a little, but we know more or less what we're talking about in that quadrant. So first step, define your quadrant and name your quadrant. We then ask folks to come back together and to discuss the strategies that help us cope with or deal with or live in that scenario. And our invitation were, what actions, frameworks, agreements, or rituals can we think of that will help us deal with this reality? And what we noticed is that, hey, what do you notice? In just about every quadrant, there is this notice of asking and finding a trusted person or coming back to a particular person after the fact. What we call these strategies that show up and apply in just about every quadrant is we call them resilient coping strategies. So what we mean by that is, it doesn't matter who you are, where you are, what's going on, put this motherfucker in your toolkit because it'll save your life almost every time. Yeah, just learn how to do it. There were other strategies that we noticed, challenging each other, maybe you don't want to do in an environment where there's a lot of insecurity and also a lot of maybe nuance required. So some strategies are very particular for the context that they come from, and we call those hedging strategies. So hedging strategies don't export so well into different contexts, and resilient strategies export real well. Now, hedging strategies, especially, are one of the reasons why it's important to create awesome and highly functional artifacts like this mural board that we have here that allows us to debrief interested parties around the information and insight that we've generated in this workshop, and to figure out a way to store this artifact in a place and in a way in which allows it to be updated easily so that people can make use of this information over and over again and add to it as they see fit. Now, what turned out to be our problem with that squishiness around quick wins? Well, it turns out that the stakeholders that asked me to host this workshop and I had very different understanding of what quick wins might be and look like. My definition of quick wins was, hey, we have a group that has a problem and they have that problem right now. I want to offer them an experience that in that experience is actually everything that they need to help them deal with that and to help normalize that experience. Offer them a bit of catharsis and a bit of, hey, this is what you can do while we're waiting for everybody else to get on board. Versus our stakeholders that were the champions of this topic of diversity and inclusion were actually looking more of a laundry list. They were looking for a list of things that they could do that, a list of advice that this subgroup might have for them to take into their portfolio. Now, ultimately, I feel pretty good about my choice because I know how it goes. I've been asked for my advice around topics all the time that are problems I'm having, only to see that information not really used in a meaningful way or in a way that is meaningful towards them, but not meaningful towards me. So I feel real good in helping push these guys towards the sense of autonomy and agency that is serving themselves rather than sort of continuing and perpetuating the paradigm of, well, let's ask you for your advice and then you can sit back and hold tight while we consider your advice and whether or not we'll ever do something about it. So for future reference, what I would do is the same thing that actually was in part of this workshop. So objective, objective, which always brings up the idea of key results. So if there's an objective, what might I see, hear, and notice that lets me know I'm on the happy path to nail down that objective? In an alternative universe, I hope I ask them, hey, what do we see, hear, and notice that lets us know we have quick wins so that I can make sure that I give you the right laundry list of quick wins. That may have turned out to be a better workshop. That may have turned out to be a worse workshop. But at least we would have known before the fact that there was some ambiguity rather than after the fact. But hey, we live and learn, and maybe you learned something from this video as well. So it's one great irony, actually, about this topic of diversity and inclusion that, sometimes the subgroup that we are serving in being inclusive is such an extreme minority that we do have to ask the question of, how much different thinking and different thinkers do we want to accommodate here? I've got a lot to say about this topic, but perhaps at a later date. Again, my name's Jeremy Nathaniel Akers. I thank you very much for your time, attention, and energy, and cushes.